One of the reasons that the Godzilla films of the 50s and 60s, as well as all the Toho science fiction films of that era, seem to stand the test of time is that almost all of them had really good screenplays. By and large, Toho depended on two screenwriters during that time. Their names were Takeshi Kimura and the writer of this film, Shinichi Sekizawa.
Born in Kyoto on June 2nd of 1921, Shinichi Sekizawa's path to screenwriting was remarkable. His first work in films was actually doing animation prior to the war, and he also produced comics. But this was really just a hobby for him because his real goal was to make movies, though in retrospect he came to realize that this background helped him to visualize all the stories that he would tell. He did direct and write a feature film called The Fearful Attack of the Flying Saucer for Shin Toho in 1956, and after that he started concentrating on writing screenplays, taking on many of Toho's science fiction films. Sekizawa considered himself a kind of specialist in this genre. For one thing, it seemed that nobody else was interested in writing the stories for this kind of film. Usually a story treatment would come to him, and rather than get bogged down in the details, he would just skim through it and take out the best parts, and then work from there. And after discussion with the main staff, he would produce a script within about 20 days.
The lighter tone of Sekizawa's works was reflected in his philosophy of writing. To him, the overwhelming factor was that a story be fun and entertaining. He never thought of himself as an expert in any field like science or space, and he felt the audience would get lost if there was too much detail. As long as it looked good and worked dramatically, the audience would be happy. Sekizawa also longed to do other projects as well. He was a writer on the first Ultraman, helping Eiji Tsuburaya when his first writer wasn't up to the task. He also wrote animation screenplays for Toei in the late 60s, such as Gulliver's Travels in Space. Technically, he shouldn't have done them since he was working for Toho at the time, but when Toho told him that they would not make their own animation films for him to write, he went ahead and did it anyway. Sekizawa also wrote many song lyrics, some of them for Godzilla films of the 1970s. In the 1960s, what typically happened was an original story treatment by a team of writers was presented to the scriptwriter for development into a full scenario. The treatment for Mothra vs. Godzilla was much different from the film we're watching now. We'd like to give you an overview of the treatment so you can understand the changes that were made by screenwriter Sekizawa and also by director Ishiro Honda. Originally, there were many more characters, and most of them were actually quite different from the ones we see in this movie. For one thing, the character of Torahata, the villain, wasn't included. Sakai, the reporter, had two sidekicks. One of them was Dr. Miura, but he was only vaguely reminiscent of the final character that we see in the movie. And there was another scientist who was kind of an amateur biologist that was being mentored by Dr. Miura. But when Sekizawa discussed this story with Honda and producer Tomoyuki Tanaka and special effects director Tsuburaya, the second scientist was one of the first things to go.
Rather than Mothra's egg being washed ashore and becoming the target of the greedy entrepreneur for exploitation, it is Godzilla's body that is found in the aftermath of the hurricane. Even if everyone truly believed Godzilla to be dead, his body would still be the equivalent of a radioactive waste dump, something that would be very difficult to commercialize. This really seemed quite a stretch, even for a film where suspension of disbelief gets a wide berth, so Sekizawa changed it to Mothra's egg, and that was a big step forward in making the story work on a basic level. The visit of the main characters to Infant Island to beg for assistance against Godzilla was based on the idea that they would offer themselves up as hostages to prove their good intentions. This aspect was rewritten by Honda himself, as he was prone to do with any script. Heeding the advice of his mentor Kojiro Yamamoto, as a director he always felt it was his job to fix the story and in some way make it his own. So the plea for compassion and brotherhood, which eventually sways Mothra, that's classic Honda. In terms of special effects scenes, the electrical tower defense, the destruction of a famous castle, and the battle with the adult Mothra are the only things which survived conceptually into the final version. This film was a bit of a more direct sequel to Mothra in that Godzilla threatens Rolitica, and the Frontier missiles, which never appear in the Japanese version, are used by that country to try and repel Godzilla, all to no avail. Rather than appearing in Nagoya, Godzilla destroys Himeji Castle. This is interesting in itself, since Himeji Castle is the only major castle in Japan that has survived intact. It was never taken by an enemy throughout history, and it came through World War II unscathed. After Himeji, Godzilla proceeds east towards Tokyo, where the artificial lightning defense has been set up to protect the city. Somewhat of an extension of the idea in King Kong vs. Godzilla, where Godzilla shows a weakness against electricity. However, after that tactic is used once, Godzilla develops a kind of immunity to it, so it's up to Mothra to save the populace. The conclusion of the original story was the battle with the adult Mothra, Godzilla meeting defeat when the adult traps Godzilla in a cocoon and tosses him into the ocean.